Hello everybody and welcome to Nathan on Shuffle and to my latest episode here. This is one of my favorite times of the year when you get to recap the year that you had in music and really in all things. I'm thinking about my favorite movies, my favorite shows, my favorite books. All of that type of stuff comes to mind as we close out 2022, but of course for this channel in particular, I'm thinking about my top releases, the top albums that I covered on the channel that I enjoyed throughout the year. I actually covered 100 albums this year, if you could believe it, between my new album spotlight shows, New Music Shuffle, and of course including that big year-end New Music Shuffle that I did last week that included 32 different album reviews, each one about a minute long. So really fun to cover all these different albums. So to compile all those into a top 40 list of albums was really difficult, and I spent a lot of time listening through these albums, reordering them, ranking them, and this is the list I've come up with. And of course this is just basically a snapshot in time of how I feel right now. It could shift and change as time moves on, but I wanted to give a snapshot of my top albums of the year. I'm separating out my top 16, which will be in its own show. I do that in a big album tournament style, which is a lot of fun to do. So this is just the first grouping, album number 40 all the way up to 17, all the way up until that big album tournament show, which will be coming out shortly. I'm going to put these shows out back to back pretty quickly so that you can see the top 16 right after this. So it should be fun to get into, and I think I should just get into the albums and the ones, like I said, these are just my preferences, the albums I enjoyed throughout the year. You will have a whole different list. There's some of these albums you don't care for. There's some albums you really love that I didn't include. That's just the nature of these things, but hopefully it provides an interesting perspective of my musical tastes, and maybe it'll introduce you to music you maybe didn't hear about throughout the year. I like these year-end shows because it's a way to catch up on all of the great music that came out through the year that you may have missed and just not heard about for various reasons. I know not everyone watches every single one of my reviews throughout the year, of course, so it'll be a good way to just quickly mention, and I'm going to try to do it very casually and just quickly mention and just talk off the top of my head about why I liked these. So starting at number 40, I'm including the Mars Volta and their self-titled record that came out this year. Somewhat of a return for them after a fairly long hiatus. I didn't think they would return as a band. I thought they were pretty much done with their last album prior to this, but their new album is really interesting and fun. It's more pop-oriented, not as much of that heavy prog that they're known for in some of their earlier releases. So it's a little light on the prog, but it's just a really enjoyable record, and it's interesting to see this quirky, interesting band leaning in and doing some more pop-oriented music with their prog stylings, a little bit more subdued, but still there in the background. There's a lot of world music vibes to this, a lot of stuff from their cultures and things, being, I believe, from Mexico and you know, Latin areas. So it brings in a bit of that Latin flavor to a lot of these tracks, and it just made for a really great, fun listen. It's a fairly short album. It's quick to get through, but every track is pretty fun and interesting. So that's at number 40 for me. At number 39, Umphreys McGee and their album Asking for a Friend. Umphreys McGee is a band I've really come to love through the years. Another band that's not totally embracing their prog, but definitely have leanings into prog. With their styles. Some albums lean heavier into prog than others, but they're more of a jam band and do a mixture of funk and jazz and rock and all of these different flavors, some pop influences as well. This album I felt leaned more into that poppier side of their sound with some shorter, more streamlined songs, but they're all really fun. I really liked, I believe it's called Ordinary Times, near the end of the record was a really solid song that had a lot of variety and interesting stuff in it, but it's just a really solid record that I think continues their trend of just having really solid, cool records full of great songs, and they really come to life in concert because that's what they're known for, is their jam band, taking the tracks from their albums and really expanding upon them and doing some really exciting, fun things. But that was a really cool record that I wanted to mention. At number 38, Everything Everything and their album Raw Data Feel. This is art rock from the UK, a really great band that of course, lean a little bit also into that poppier side. A lot of these bottom tier albums on my list are more in that poppier vein of music that I still really enjoy and I think is quirky and different enough to appeal to a Prague audience also. But this album really leaned into that poppier side of the band, has a bit of like an 80s pop mentality. I believe a lot of the lyrics were written by an AI. It's sort of the theme of the album, but it's a really cool album with a lot of great pop hooks that I just really found addictive listening to this year. Album number 37, this is Firmament by Dim Grey. Indie art rock, I would call it, from Norway. They had a connection with Big Big Train this year. I believe one of the members of Dim Grey also was helping out Big Big Train in concert, and I think they were playing maybe a support act for Big Big Train. But this album grabbed my attention. It was really a fascinating indie rock vibe with a very laid-back, ethereal feel. There's some really cool different instrumentation in there with, violin, cello, just a mandolin. It has these really cool flavors. Feels almost folky in its aesthetic. It feels like it's really leaning into their homeland, this Norwegian feel. And I just found it really captivating. And it contained one of my favorite songs of the year, Avalon, The Tide, which I just think is a beautiful track. And so they really hit it out of the park. Just a beautiful, ethereal album with a lot of atmosphere and just really pretty. Speaking of pretty albums, at number 36, I have Weyes Blood with And in the Darkness, Hearts Aglow. And once again, this isn't really prog at all, but it's maybe what you'd call chamber pop from the US. It's very, very much in line with singer-songwriter type music from the 70s perhaps, or late 60s. Natalie Marion, who's the main composer, main singer, main person of the project, has this voice that's very reminiscent of Karen Carpenter, and just beautiful songs, beautiful extended ballads, and just lots of orchestration and lush instrumentation. Just a really beautiful throwback record that just showcases that there's still great pop music being made nowadays. It isn't all just gone by the wayside. There's really cool bands, really cool artists making great pop music nowadays that needs to be highlighted and focused on even more in the mainstream, in my opinion. This should be stuff that's wildly popular on the level of Adele and Taylor Swift and those types of artists. Just beautiful pop music that deserves more attention. At number 35, another newer record, probably would be a few spots higher if I had more time with it, but it's a fairly recent acquisition. This is Elder's album, Innate Passage. Heavy prog from the US. Just a really great album, really compact and just packs a punch. These 5 tracks, they're all, hovering around the 10-minute mark. And they're just all really hard-hitting, have great passages of instrumentation. They have this sort of psychedelic vibe in some respects, but they do it in a heavier way. Almost reminds me a bit of like Mastodon or, the bands like that, but with a little bit of like a wobbler sensibility. I feel like this is one of their more proggy releases even, with a bit more of that synth and keyboard sound really permeating their makes. But it's just really a beautiful record that just really uncovers itself more and more. There's lots of layers and complexity in the instrumentation. Doesn't feel too show-offy. It feels like everything's in service of these pieces, and that's really refreshing. I really loved listening to it along with Jim Newstead. I watch his channel, and he featured this album fairly recently, and listening along with him was a great experience and really uncovered how great this album really is. So really a great album that deserves a spot on this list. Number 34, this came out real early in the year. This is Wilderun and Epigone or Epigone. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but this is progressive metal from the US. One of the heavier records on my list. There's a bit of that growling vocals through parts of it. But what works for me well with this is that it's not super ever present. Like, it's done sparingly enough that I can enjoy the album even though I'm not into the more aggressive vocals. It reminds me a lot of Opeth and what they're able to do with blending these more laid-back, folkier styles with the more heavy intensity. And there's definitely heavy, intense moments throughout this album, but there's also lots of really gorgeous, ethereal, atmospheric moments and almost a folky vibe that really permeates throughout as well. So it's just a really good balance and blend of these different flavors that I really liked. Just some of these tracks like Passenger and Identifier, they're just really cool epic tracks that go through so many different things. There's heaviness and intensity, blast beats and all of that kind of thing, but then they lay it back and do like really pretty vocals and really great lush sounds, and I just really found myself captivated by that record. So putting that on my list. At number 33, I have Tears for Fears, The Tipping Point. Once again, not really supremely proggy, more of an art pop type of flavor. Of course, Tears for Fears are a very legendary, important band that was very prominent in the 80s and came out with some huge hits, but here they are with a late career album that really hit the mark. It's a shorter album, but it's really a great crafted album. It feels very carefully composed, has that poppy feel, almost a Beatles-esque vibe in sections, but also leans back into their 80s style sound as well, providing a really cool compact album that I just really found captivating. I love No Small Thing. I love Rivers of Mercy is a beautiful ballad that really touches me. Master Plan is a cool Beatles-esque track. Just a really great pop record that, once again, like I was talking about with Wise Blood, wish that pop like this was popular in the mainstream more than it is, and that these types of tracks were played more on radio or made bigger waves on Spotify or whatever the kids are listening to now. So this is just a really beautiful, cool, well-crafted pop album that Roland and Kurt just did an amazing job here, and it's just a real highlight for me of the year. Number 32, Tiger Moth Tales, A Song of Spring. This is neo-prog from the US. Of course, this is Peter Jones' project. He's an incredible multi-instrumentalist and singer who has helmed this Tiger Moth Tales for quite some time, doing these more seasonal albums. This is A Song of Spring. He also did a winter album not too long ago, and I can feel that. I feel the spring vibes on this album, and it's a good balance between some really lighthearted, fun type of tracks, but also some more heavy, serious stuff as well. You know, there's some tracks that are almost dark in their aesthetic, like Dance Till Death, but then you've got Mad March Hare, which is just a total like fun romp and just harkens back to the most whimsical Genesis that you could hear back in the mid-70s. So really great album. It's impressive that Peter Jones really tackles all of the instrumentation here, with aside from some guest guitar from Andy Latimer, but it's just a really tight record with some beautiful sounds, and I think Peter Jones is a musician that deserves to be heard. Number 31, Moonletters, and the album Thank You From the Future. This is heavy prog from the US. I don't know if I'd quite say heavy prog, but there's eclectic prog, symphonic prog. It's a big stew of a lot of different things, but it feels like a good mixture of some classic prog sounds like you'd hear from Yes and Genesis and Gentle Giant, but brought into a more modern sound. And it really worked well for me. I think it's a really cool group, and the track list is really strong. Every track somewhat leads into the next, and it all feels related, and it just feels like a really good set of songs that really leans into this quirkier symphonic prog aesthetic that I really enjoy. So that was a really solid release that came out mid-year that I really enjoyed. Number 30, this is Joshua Batten and Learn to Live Again. Once again, there's prog leanings in here, but I would call this more folk singer-songwriter type vein. It's a sprawling concept album basically about Joshua's dealing with the pandemic, dealing with his own personal anxieties and personal issues that he deals with, and doing it in such a beautiful fashion with a really great album that explores a lot of interesting emotions and goes through a lot of different moods and a lot of different styles. There's some power pop type things that are really fun to listen to. There's some more country folk flavor stuff that you hear, and then of course a little bits of prog like Existential Guardian, which is a near 14-minute epic that is towards the second half of the album. So you get some hard rock, you get some, classic rock, you get all styles and flavors, showing that Joshua is a very multifaceted artist with a lot of interests, and he really crafted a really cool album. And I'm thankful for him for reaching out to me and suggesting his album to me. I think it really was one of my highlights of the year, and I really appreciated it. An incredible artist from Australia. And speaking of Australian artists, we get to Ben Craven at number 29 and Monsters from the Id. A really cool crossover prog from Australia. There's only 2 tracks here, 2 epics, And they're both fantastic, very cinematic in scope, a lot of different sounds, a lot of different styles thrown in the mix. I really like the soundscapes and how it really builds into this great cinematic outburst and really has cool moments throughout. It almost sounds like you're listening to a soundtrack in certain moments, but there's definitely the symphonic Prague influences as well. Just some great stuff, great instrumentals, great expansive pieces. You can't go wrong with me in giving me an epic, and giving two epics that are both really, really solid. And once again, like a one-man band type of thing situation again, with Ben Craven pretty much doing all of the work here himself. And so that makes it even all the more impressive that one man can put together such an incredible release with some really great sounds. At number 28, I have Lonely Robot and the album A Model Life. This is the project of John Mitchell, who is known in the Prague sphere through Arena, Frost, all the different projects that he's been a part of. It Bites as well. He's a really multifaceted musician, a great guitarist, great vocalist, and this is basically his solo project, which is a lot of fun to listen to. This album was a bit more personal than some of his past albums were. His Lonely Robot first 3 albums were part of a trilogy, what they call basically the Astronaut Trilogy, sci-fi tales set to music. But this is more just delving into his personal life and dealing with some of his own personal situations with his relationships and things that happened to him. Maybe a little bit of that pandemic vibe also on this record, but it's a really solid set of songs. If you like the other projects that John Mitchell's a part of, Frost, Arena, It Bites, you'll probably like this as well. He just has a really cool, streamlined sound. Not super proggy, I would say, but more art rock style with some 80s influences, but really solid songwriting and some really great tracks that showcase him as an artist. Number 27, I have Evership and the Uncrowned King Act 2. This is Neo-Prog from the US, and this is a continuation from the Act 1 album, which I believe was on my list last year. More of the same, more good stuff, solid tracks. What I find interesting about Evership is they're lumped in with prog a lot, but they're not totally overtly progressive in my eyes. There's definitely prog leanings, but I feel like they more have that flavor of that art rock of the 70s, like Queen and Styx and bands of that nature, Journey. Those come to mind more often, with the more theatrical style, some more streamlined classic rock influence, but there are proggy bits mixed throughout with some great keyboard work. But it's a really cool album that tells a story, it's a concept, and it works well. All the pieces really hit very well. There's some guest focus from Michael Sadler on vocals from Saga on The Voice of the New Day, which is a great track. I love Coronation. I think that's a really quirky, fun proggy track. And there's some great ballads that showcase the incredible vocals of Bo West. And it's just a really cool album that's compact and fun to listen to. So recommend that one. Number 26, Kite Parade, The Way Home. This is crossover prog from the UK. This is basically the product of Andy Foster, who's a multi-instrumentalist artist and musician. It's a really cool blend between prog, rock, and cool, interesting pop music. This is a debut album from this project. Kite Parade came out in March this year. The first single, Letting Go, which is the opening track, really, really struck me this year. It was a really cool piece of fun pop prog, in my opinion. There's a lot in common here with It Bites, and somewhat in common with the John Mitchell stuff that I was just mentioning. But I find that a really fascinating blend where there's some quirky, cool proggy stuff, but really great melodic hooks that really draw you in and make for a fun, addictive listen. So I just really appreciated this. Somewhat of ear candy for me. A lot of fun songs. It ends with a bit of an epic called Stranded, which I believe is about 15 minutes long. So you get a bit of that epic flavor, similar to like what It Bites does. They have some of those longer pieces also, but they keep their pop aesthetic. And I feel like this is much in the same vein. So really cool album that maybe is under the radar for a lot of people, but I recommend seeking it out. It's a really fun one. Number 25, I have Glass Hammer and their album At the Gate. This is symphonic prog from the US, Nashville-based band. Or Tennessee-based. They're a really cool group that have had such a storied history in Prague. They've had so many albums at this point, but this is the last of their Scalagrim trilogy of albums, which follows one particular storyline, a sword and sorcery type novel. So it's very conceptual, has a lot of that flavor to it, but I really like this album. It might be my favorite of the three. Bringing on Hannah Pryor on vocals was a real masterstroke. She was on the last album as well, and her voice is just really fantastic. These latest albums have really focused on their heavier sound, some almost proto-metal vibes to it, alongside of their symphonic style. But I appreciated this album that they really blended those well, and have a couple tracks that really harken back to their more symphonic prog days, which I really appreciated. The Years Roll By is a fantastic opener, and the finale, It's Love, is just a really great symphonic piece that really closes this series out. But in the middle of all that, you have some really hard-hitting, heavy rock stuff that is more in line with like classic Black Sabbath and old school Rush, perhaps. But it's really fun. The band reached out to me to review their album and reached out to me to react to one of their songs, All Alone, that they utilized as part of their music video for it. So I have a place in my heart for this and its placement this year. I really love this band, and I really respect and appreciate what they do. So that is a solid entry. Number 24, Perius and The Signal Heard Throughout Space. Once again, another U.S. group. A lot of U.S. groups making it on my list. Really cool progressive metal style. I believe before this album they were more known as like a death metal band with a lot more heaviness and aggression and heavy growling vocals, which you hear a little bit of on this record, but it's more sparse. Enough that I can handle it, but it is there just to warn you if you're not into the growling and that style. But what you have in the midst of that is just a really strong progressive metal epic that is conceptual. It tells a storyline that's very sci-fi, heady concept. Sounds a bit like Haken in places. They go through a lot of different styles and a lot of virtuoso playing. I really like the Acid Lakes of Ganymede as well as the finale, Arecibo. Just really cool classic stuff that's really fun to listen to. They are incredible musicians, and it's just an incredible ride. Really exciting and fun, and especially listening to that last track just really amped me up and made me realize that this is some of the most fun I've had with music in the year. So had to feature it on my list at some point. And so there it is at number 24. At number 23, I have Bubble Math's album, Turf Ascension. This is another U.S. band. This is eclectic prog, very eclectic. It's only 4 tracks. The first track's almost 20 minutes. The other 3 are about 10 minutes each. And it's really epic, cool prog, very twisted, very complicated, almost math rocky in parts. You know, this is a band I always find interesting when I listen to, because I always listen really fascinated by the complexity and how they build the layers of what they're doing. But it's like an impressive listen. It's like listening to this feat of this band trying to pull off this really elaborate stunt or something. When I am away from it, maybe some of the songs aren't as memorable, but the way that I'm so impressed with what they do really trumps that feeling that I think they really have some incredible musicianship. They have some cool vocal moments. Sometimes they even veer into like the Gentle Giant style, counterpoint vocals a little bit. But really, it's really complex, cool, proggy music if you like your Gentle Giants. I think that's a good reference point in some ways. Maybe a bit like Anglagard and other bands of that nature that focus a lot on these quirky, complex instrumentals. So it's a really cool band with some almost avant-garde tendencies and some angular feel, but really solid record that I thought they really did a great job with, so I wanted to put that on my list. Number 22 is Star One, Revel in Time. This is progressive metal, of course, from the Netherlands, from Arjen Anthony Lucassen. This is one of his projects. This leans more into the metal direction as opposed to Arion, which is more in the prog direction. Of course, the lines are blurred a little bit. There's little bits of prog in the mix in this album, but there's also metal tendencies in his Arion albums. But I just thought this was a fun ride. It's a album that's conceptual in nature because each track basically covers a different sci-fi movie that deals with time travel. So you get really fun lyrics, really fun vocalist. Each track features a different vocalist that's really notable in the metal, power metal, prog space. Really fun stuff all the way throughout, covering some really great movies. I'm a big sci-fi nerd, so I knew most of these movies, and it's fun to hear his take on these tracks. I really like Prescient. I talked about it in my top songs of the year. Really find that a cool proggy piece. Revel in Time is just a fun romp. I really like The Year of 41, Lost Children of the Universe that closes out the album, which discusses Interstellar, another great sci-fi epic, really great track. And so it's just really solid playing, really fun time. I had some of the most fun this year listening to this album because it's just a blast to go through. It has some great performances with some incredible musicians. Arjen always assembles an A-list cast to be on his album, so I definitely had to have that in my list. Number 21, Bait Scarp and the album You Have It All. This is crossover prog from the US. Basically the project of Adam Sears, who does the vocals, synths, pianos, organs, has a whole bunch of other people on board as well. But it's a really cool album that's harkening back to like classic Spock's Beard and things like that. Definitely has that vibe to it. A really strong list of tracks, some epics in the mix here, like the title track You Have It All, and then the Flowing Through the Change track that ends the album. But there's some jazzier bits, there's some cool guest stars. You got Jimmy Keegan on drums, Billy Sherwood on vocals, John Davison, Ryo Okamoto is guesting here. So you got a lot of cool progressive rock influences here, and just some beautiful tracks that run the gamut between that somewhat classic Spock's Beard style, some symphonic influences from Yes and Genesis, but brought into a more modern aesthetic as well. But it's a really fun album that I really liked a lot as I listened to it this year. Number 20 is Devin Townsend's Lightwork. Of course, Devin Townsend's from Canada. He's somewhat of an experimental post-metal type artist who's done so many different releases that are all varied and interesting in their own way. I really love Lightwork. It's my favorite thing from him, probably because I'm not as into the more aggressive styles that he's known for usually. I really did like Empath as well, but I feel like this is a good follow-up and a cool answer to the pandemic and lockdowns and all that went on there. I think this is his response to that. And instead of being angry or upset or coming out with something really aggressive, it's a really lighthearted album with a lot of pop influence and basically gives you a bit of a beacon in the storm. You know, it gives you some hope and some light, and I think that's much needed at this time. And there's just some beautiful, cool poppy tunes like Moon People and Call of the Void in the first part of the record. And then there also, you know, he still reserves room to do things that are a bit more experimental and a bit more complex also later in the record. So you get a bit of both sides. And there's a second disc called Nightwork that really leans into the more aggressive, heavier styles that he's been known for. So it's just a beautiful record, really thoughtfully composed. You could tell a lot of work went into this album and crafting some really complex, cool layers of sound, and I just fell in love with it. I think it's an incredible record that I wanted to focus on. Number 19, I have David Lungden's album Door 1. This is more almost singer-songwriter music, maybe with very small folk and prog leanings from the UK. David Lungden was the lead vocalist, multi-instrumentalist, writer for Big Big Train. Unfortunately, he passed away last year. It was a really sad event. But he had been working on a solo album, which it sounds like was about 90% complete at the time. And so those people involved in it and his family and friends and such put this album together with a lot of love and respect. And it's a really beautiful statement. It's a beautiful collection of tracks that really celebrate an incredible artist and show another side to him than what you see in Big Big Train's music. And it's a beautiful album that really touched me. It's almost difficult to listen to for a lot of us who are very close to the band and who were very saddened by the news of his passing. So it's hard in a way to listen to, but I think it's a fitting tribute to him and his work, and it's a beautiful record that deserves some recognition, and people need to listen to this. So really great album that surprised me even, and is even better than I expected. So really check that one out. It's a really beautiful album. Number 18 is Kaipa and their album Urskog. This is symphonic prog from Sweden, a band that I've always loved. I really like their style, very much harkening back to the big bombast of Yes. They were a band that were around back in the 70s, but reformed in their newest configuration in the 2000s, I believe. And they've been going strong and releasing albums consistently ever since. And this is another strong entry into their catalog. Some really cool instrumental sections, playing really expertly. There's some epics here. The Frozen Dead of Night opens the album, which is a really interesting track because it's almost a slow burn throughout that whole runtime. You expect like these big progressive fireworks and for them to all of a sudden get a lot faster paced and a lot of excitement, but it really stays in this very mid-tempo range, which is really interesting. But you get a bit more of that up-tempo stuff later on in the album. The Bitter Setting Sun is an incredible closing epic. So it's a really solid album that I really enjoyed this year, and a lot of great work went into this. So really right up my street of the type of prog that I tend to gravitate towards. This very light, positive, fun, bouncy type work with a lot of cool hooks and really interesting playing. So really like that. And number 17, just barely missing my top 16 tournament, is Jonas Lindbergh and The Other Side and Miles from Nowhere, another crossover prog from Sweden. Incredible artist, incredible album. This actually was in my top 16, but something floated in at the last minute and came into the mix, so I had to bump this one just at the last minute there. But it's a really solid album, really showcases a new artist who's really a rising talent in the scene. Once again, this harkens back to all the artists that I love, to Spock's Beard, to Flower Kings, to Transatlantic, and it has definitely that vibe all the way through. Every track is strong. There's a couple epics in the make. Summer Queen is like a 15-minute song. Miles from Nowhere, the title track, is this multi-song suite epic that's really, really great. Even focuses and features some guitar work from Royna Stolt in one section. So really, really cool album with that classic feel and flavor. Just a really fun listen. Just really cool all the way around. And I really recommend it to all lovers of prog, especially the newer wave of prog like Flower Kings and Spock's Beard. There's just, I can't see you not enjoying it on some level because it's just a really fun, joyful listen with a lot of fun, expressive tracks that Jonas Lindbergh really knocked it out of the park with this, with some great playing. There's multiple vocalists, which adds to the variety and interest. Also, there's some shorter tracks that are more single bass like Little Man and Why I'm Here, but then these more expansive tracks that really focus on great prog, but with some really cool, strong pop hooks. And I really like that flavor, of course. So those are the albums that really captivated me this year. I have the top 16 coming in its own episode, as I said, in a big tournament style. So feel free to hopefully check that one out soon. And that's it for me for this episode. Hopefully you guys found an album here that you guys like. Please let me know in the comments some of your albums that you liked this year. Maybe some that you're surprised were on this list. Of course, reserve some wiggle room for some of the albums I'm going to be featuring in my top 16. Some of the heavy favorites of the year are probably going to be in that show that you might expect to see. So really fun to recap and to talk about this today. So thank you guys for joining me. And as always, just keep enjoying the music out there. Thank you, everybody. Bye.